Hello, and welcome to Second Best University, a reading companion podcast for Dungeons & Dragons. I'm Steven, and I'll be your book club buddy. Let's get into it. What? Where's Second Best a D&D Adventure? Reading companion podcast, university? Did you trick me into school? All right, easy everybody. Let's all calm down. Second Best, a D&D Adventure is still releasing on its regular schedule. Nothing is changing. It comes out every other Wednesday. This is going to go on the in-between Wednesdays because it's a fun addition to Second Best, a D&D Adventure. What is this? This is a podcast about the Dungeons & Dragons rules. It's not an actual play podcast. I won't be playing Dungeons & Dragons. I will be talking about Dungeons & Dragons. Why would you listen to somebody talk about Dungeons & Dragons? Well, maybe you're like me, where you love playing D&D, you love rolling dice, and you love crits, and you love role-playing, but you want to know the rules better. Either you don't know them very well at all, and you've been a fan for a while and you want to dig in, or you've been playing for a really long time and you want a refresher, or to go deeper, or to get different and more interesting, varied takes on a particular rule. Well, how are we going to do that? What is this podcast? Every episode, we're going to read a section of a rule book, and then we're going to talk about it. I'll give you summaries of the major topics and my takes on them, as well as tips for players and tools for DMs about things I've seen work or strategies that make sense to me, as well as incorporating other insights that I've gleaned while researching whatever the rules are. I'll also do extracurriculars on top of whatever we read, which is like talking about D&D culture and history, so that if you're a new player, you won't sit down with a bunch of veterans and not know any of their references. You'll understand why they're laughing about a gazebo. I'll do silly bits because, to be absolutely frank, I can't go more than 2 minutes without making silly bits. That's just who I've become, I suppose. I'll talk about spells and monsters sometimes, even though those are more listy in the books. And we'll also sometimes have guests. Not every episode, but when it's appropriate. I know I've said the word reading a lot, and I have been at book clubs, and I understand that for most people, book clubs are an excuse to drink wine. I can't give you wine, so why would you read? You don't have to. If you don't want to read, don't read. It's totally cool. I'm going to read for you and then give you summaries and my takes, and I can't force you to do anything. I'm a podcast. You could stop me at any moment. You could end this right here, right now. So there's no pressure. Just read if you want to, and if you don't, enjoy yourself. So, what is this? It's a reading companion podcast for Dungeons & Dragons. Like I said! Okay, if this is a reading companion podcast, then what are we reading? The first book we're going to read is The Basic Rules. Yeah! The Basic Rules cover the fundamentals of how to play D&D, like creating a character and running the game and using abilities and combat, the whole shebang, everything you need to play Dungeons & Dragons. The Basic Rules are not the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. There is a separate document called Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Basic Rules. That's what I'm talking about. Now, where can you get it? Because I bet you've been in a bookstore and you've looked for all the D&D books and you've never seen this one. Well, that's because this one is 100% free and it's online. You can find it by searching Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Basic Rules, or D&D Basic Rules, or honestly even Basic Rules. It should still be the first search result because it's such a popular game. It's completely free from Wizards. You're not pirating anything. You can download it. You can read it online. You can send it to an e-reader. You can even do what your boy did and print it out if you're feeling freaky. If you're going to print it, I want to give you some guidelines. We're not going to read 85 pages this episode, but overall, in the course of reading the Basic Rules, we're only going to need the first 85 pages of this document. After that, it's more like references to spells and lists of things, and we're not going to read those. If you want to reference those later, you know where to find them. And if you're printing, don't forget to double-side it. You know, try to save paper when you can. Another note about the Basic Rules is that they're written in the order that you would make a character. So they're written race, class, background, equipment, those kind of things, in that order. which means that you encounter a lot of exceptions to the core rules before you get to the core rules. So when we're going through it, we're going to change the order up. I'm not going to read Introduction, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. We're going to bounce around so that you know the rules before you learn the exceptions that races and classes and backgrounds put on those rules. So I'll tell you at the beginning of each episode what we're reading that episode. Speaking of talking about what we're reading at the beginning of the episode, let's talk about what we're reading. This episode, we're going to be reading the introduction in the basic rules. It's just pages 3, 4, 5, and 6. Usually we'll read a little more than 4 pages, but this is the introduction and it's very foundational to what Dungeons & Dragons is, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the game actually is, so that when we're talking about rules, you understand the context that the rules will be brought into. Full disclosure, this is not a particularly rulesy episode for a rules podcast, but don't worry, we're just setting a nice foundation so that next time we can really get into it. Anyway, go ahead and read those 4 pages if you want to, and if not, don't worry about it. I've got some wonderful music from our own Marty Scanlon that you can listen to while the others read. We will be back at the 7-minute and 25-second mark. All right, happy reading. Hey, welcome back. Hope you had a good time reading. All right, let's get into talking about it. So, the first thing we read is the introduction, and the first part of the introduction is another introduction to the rest of the introduction, which I think is so freaking cute. There are a lot of really great quotes on this first page that really, they express so clearly what Dungeons & Dragons is all about. They're also mixed in with all these weird fluff and flavor about a D&D group that doesn't really exist. So I cut out all that fluff and I strung together my favorite quotes to get a definition of Dungeons & Dragons, and here's what I came up with. The Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game is about storytelling. In the game, each player creates a character. The DM creates adventures for the characters, who navigate its hazards and decide which paths to explore. D&D gives structure and a way of determining the consequences of the adventurer's actions. There's no winning and losing in the Dungeons & Dragons game. If everyone had a good time and created a memorable story, they all win. That's so sweet! This is so wonderful! I think that's a great, wonderful description of D&D or of any role-playing game. It's about storytelling, and the rules give the story structure. That is so excellent. Man, I really love that. I also love that D&D defines itself as a game where the way to win, the way to win, is for everyone to have a good time. You can't say that about soccer. You can win soccer and everyone can be miserable. And I like soccer. I'm not saying that to denigrate soccer, but wow, what a cool game. I love it. I think it's important, even as we start reading rule books, to remember that when you're studying the rules, you can get really sucked into the mindset of the rules, but the rules are actually not the most important part of the game. They give structure to the most important part of the game, which is the story. There's actually this probably apocryphal quote that is attributed to Gary Gygax, one of the creators of D&D, and the quote is, "The secret we should never let the game masters know is that they don't need any rules." And that is so not true. It's incredible how false that is, but it's really heartwarming. It's a really nice sentiment that I think they've expressed really clearly here before they give you all of the rules. So, in the introduction, they also cover a lot of the basics of playing Dungeons and Dragons, which means they present a lot of information sort of haphazardly. I'm going to try to walk you through it the way that I think most people come to it, which is I want you to imagine that you've just stumbled upon a group of people playing Dungeons and Dragons. And let's say for this session, they are going to just let you observe them. So let's talk about what you see. Right off the bat, what you're going to notice at a Dungeons and Dragons game is that there are people and they're gathered together. Not a surprise for a game. One of the people is going to be removed from the others in some way. Usually they'll be removed with a screen. Sometimes they'll just have space between them and the other players. But let's say in this case, they have a screen. We're going to call this removed player the Dungeon Master, or the DM for short. You notice that the Dungeon Master talks a lot, and they're pretty much always the center of attention. They do a lot of really silly voices, pretending to be many different characters. All of the other people are taking turns talking to each other and the Dungeon Master, so they're not as often the center of attention. They only speak in one silly voice and are only ever one character. These people will each have some papers in front of them that you notice, and we call those people the players. So there's the Dungeon Master behind the screen doing lots of silly voices, and the players with their sheets who have only one silly voice. So one thing that would strike you if you were expecting like a regular game night is that there's not a board in the middle of these people. There's not a deck of cards. There's only occasionally a really loose sense of whose turn it is or whether turns are necessary. So if you're expecting a traditional game, all of that will seem weird to you, and maybe the only thing that will sort of anchor you is that each person, players and the Dungeon Master, will have dice and they will roll them. So we're going to try to figure that out a little bit. So far we've got Dungeon Master with a screen and dice, players with sheets and dice, and all they're doing this whole time is talking about a story, and they're doing different characters, most of whom are played by the Dungeon Master, the rest of whom are played by individual players. If you observed the game for like a while, and you will because it will go on for hours, you might notice that the conversation follows a loop of describe, decide, determine. So, describe. The Dungeon Master tells players what's going on. Then, decide. The players choose what to do next. And finally, they determine. The Dungeon Master either says, okay, to the player's decision, or asks players to roll dice and then compares the outcome to something that the Dungeon Master has behind the screen, which we'll say is secret information. So, describe, decide, determine. If you watched for a long time, you might realize that pretty much the only time rules come up is in the determine section of the game. You notice that during determining, sometimes players have to look at the papers, which we call character sheets, in front of them. And you might realize that that's sort of where the rules of the game are being kept, is somewhere on these sheets. So you take a glance over a player's shoulder to see what's written down on these sheets. Oh my god. Oh geez. Okay, well that's a lot of information. This is an Excel spreadsheet nightmare, and I never want to play a game as arcane as this. It's so packed. But if you were to look at a character sheet, what you'd probably notice right away is there are 6 big numbers that would catch your eye. These 6 numbers are called the core abilities, and they're labeled for you, helpfully. The core abilities are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. You don't have to memorize them, there is not a quiz later. But you see these 6 big numbers everywhere. Each player's character sheet has these same abilities, and in each of these abilities, like next to the word strength or wisdom, they have a score from 3 to 20. And if you were to walk around the table and peek behind the Dungeon Master's screen, you'd see they have a lot of mini versions of the sheets, and they probably have about one for every character they're playing. So every character has a version of these sheets, and every character has these 6 core abilities. Okay, so characters have sheets, sheets have numbers, and you notice as you're watching people describe, decide, determine, that the players and the Dungeon Masters tend to look at the sheet right before they're rolling dice. They roll the dice, they look at the sheet, and then they add something. This part is more arcane, and it will probably not You wouldn't be able to figure it out, I don't think. But if you ask the players, they'll point out the most important numbers on their sheet are actually not the core abilities, they're the modifiers. What? So each core ability, it has that number from 3 to 20. It also has a modifier, which is a smaller number next to the 3 to 20 number, the score. And this modifier is the number that players add to dice when they use that ability. So if the DM described a heavy rock and the player decided to lift it, then the DM would ask for a strength check. The player would roll one of their dice and add their strength modifier to it, not their strength score. And then they would tell the DM the result. The DM would look at the secret information behind the screen, and together they would determine what happens next. So if you watched all of that and you've sort of gotten this far, you're, first of all, an excellent watcher and listener. But if you watched a really long time, really paying attention, you might realize that there's only 5 types of rolls that the players ever do. And you figure out what those 5 are. They're skill checks, attack rolls, saving throws, damage, and death. If you somehow figured out these roll types, then you'd see that almost all of them are on the 20-sided dice, or D20. When we talk about dice in D&D, we say D, and then we say the number of sides they have. So, the D20 rolls are skill checks, attack rolls, saving throws, and death rolls. Everything but damage happens on the D20, when it comes to player rolls, at least. You'd also notice, if you watched a while, that death rolls are the only rolls that players don't add modifiers to. They never add anything to death rolls. So they're fairly rare, so we can kind of forget about them for now a little bit, and say that the main rolls are skill, attack, and saving throws. So skill, attack, save. Skill, attack, save. SAS are the main D20 rolls, and damage has its own dice. So now you kind of really would get what's happening at this table. These people are telling a story that none of them really knows the entirety of. The players interact with the world of the story through the Dungeon Master, who has secret information about the statistics of the world. Storytelling takes the form of describe, decide, determine, and determine is where all the rules happen. During determine, players use their abilities to overcome the obstacles presented by the Dungeon Master's secret information. The majority of the rolls are on 20-sided dice and are skill, attack, or save rolls, or as we'll call them, SAS rolls. That, roughly, is what Dungeons & Dragons is. Dang, that was a bunch of rules. And I really enjoy them, but I'd rather take a break and maybe learn a little bit about the history of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's go talk to my old friend, the Lore Bard, who will tell us about the origins of D&D. Come, let's visit him at his nursing home.
Oh, jeez. Oh, a back shouldn't feel like that. Oh, hey there. Barely saw you walk in because my eyes are so bad because I'm old. Well, I suppose you came to learn a little bit more about the history of Dungeons & Dragons, eh? Since that's the only reason anyone visits me. That's all I am now, is like a dictionary. You don't think about it until you need it. You keep it on a shelf and you don't visit. Huh? You don't want to hear about it? Okay, well, what can I tell you about this time? The history of Dungeons & Dragons, the origin of it, the very beginning. My goodness, what a great time. Oh, I lived for it back then. Everything was better in the past. You've ruined it. You and everyone like you. Our story starts in the Twin Cities, which is St. Paul and Minneapolis in Minnesota in the United States on Earth. It starts there with a group of people playing war games, which are like reenactments of famous battles using miniatures, rulers, and maps. Not like all of this role-playing you do now where you just describe things. We measured back then. Anyway, Dave Arneson was a young security guard and a history major, and he hosted a lot of war games at his house. And he hated rules lawyers, and so he began the practice of having a referee. Someone to adjudicate situations that weren't covered by the rules. That's Arneson. So Dave Arneson's friend, David Wazzelli, he creates a game called Brownstein, which is a war game still, but it's set in a town called Brownstein that never existed. And he took these huge steps of requiring a referee, not just doing it because Dave said so, but building it into the rules, and having every player not command an army, but instead play the role of one character, which is huge. So that's David Wazzelli did that. Let me see here. Huh? I shouldn't fall asleep. I'm still in the middle of the lesson. Okay. So anyway, Dave Arneson, the first Dave, he attends this thing called Gen Con. He attends the second one. Gen Con is still going on. It's a huge gaming convention. Anyway, at Gen Con, Dave Arneson meets this guy named Gary Gygax. Now, Gygax is a struggling father of 5, but he loves war games. Gygax and Arneson get along super great. They really see eye to eye about the future of wargaming and how guys in basements are really smart and they really enjoy each other. So, Gygax, he's trying to make money selling his own tabletop wargame that he calls Chainmail, which still has players commanding units, but it moves wargaming into a medieval setting, using maces and armor instead of muskets and artillery. So Arneson likes this guy, Gygax. He picks up Gygax's Chainmail, and then they part ways. But Arneson starts playing Chainmail in his basement, and he's like, this is pretty great. He plays it for like a month with his friends. He really loves it. And then one night his friends leave, and they all have to go home to look at spreadsheets and talk about war. And then Dave is sitting at home alone, and he thinks, wow, it would be great to combine Chainmail, which I love, with that thing Wazzelli did, Brownstein. I love Brownstein. So Arneson makes this setting that he calls Blackmoor. Now, Blackmoor is a huge hit with Arneson's friends. He invites them over to play in this fantasy role-playing setting, Blackmoor, and they love it. They play for about 3 straight years, just right off the bat, 3 years, which is not so. It's way too much, but everyone's playing different things. The King of Portugal is there. There's somebody who's telling everybody what their characters are. It's so popular, he ends up making a little newsletter so that if you miss a session, you can catch up with what happened in Blackmoor. It's wild. So, at some point, about 1972, 1973, Dave Arneson remembers that Gygax is around, and he's like, hey, you should come over and check out Blackmoor. So Gygax comes over and he's like, whoa, this is really good. I really appreciate what you've done with what I started. So the two of them collaborate and they publish a game. They don't have a name for it while they're testing it. And then Gygax's daughter, his young daughter, says, this game's full of Dungeons and Dragons. And they just steal that from her. They just take it because she's a kid. And that's what old people should do to kids. They take their ideas and they profit. Anyway, they publish Dungeons and Dragons, which we now call Original Dungeons and Dragons, or OD&D. And within a few years, it's a huge success. It turns gaming on its head. Everyone's playing role-playing. Nobody's playing war games anymore. And it shoots Arneson and Gygax up to the kinds of creative peaks that most people can only dream of. They're splitting up, they sue each other, and then they publicly hate each other for the rest of their lives. And that's, I guess, as much as I can ramble about that topic. Please come visit, though. And if you can bring my AARP from the front door and just leave it somewhere in the sitting room so that I can look at it later and...
Okay, goodbye! Now let's get back to talking about rules. Alright! We did it! We finished the introduction. We read 4 whole pages, and we deserve an award. The big takeaways from this episode are that D&D is about storytelling. It proceeds by describe, decide, determine. So DM describes, players decide, and together they determine what happens next. The big 3 D20 rolls are skill, attack, and save, or SAS, and the other rolls in the game are death and damage rolls. So SAS and D&D. I didn't say D&D during the episode, but SAS is what I want you to remember. And if you tell a memorable story and everyone has fun, you win. That is the strategy we're going to be optimizing towards as we proceed, is making sure people have fun and the story is good. I realize this is a pretty rules-light start to a rules deep dive podcast, but I think it's pretty important to establish the kind of Dungeons & Dragons that we're playing. this is a good foundation for things we'll get into later on. In particular, I think that the definition saying that D&D exists to give structure to the story and the Dungeon Master's job is to create the adventure or create the story, I think will come up a lot when we read about the flavor and the lore that is in D&D books, especially with like alignment or races or backgrounds, the kinds of things where the system sometimes tries to influence the type of adventure that they want you to have. And I think talking up front about the line between D&D and the Dungeon Master especially is really important. And knowing that the 3 big roles are skill, attack, and save seems small, but it comes up a lot. So I know it was rules light, but trust me, we're going to reference the concepts in this episode a lot moving forward, and it's important to have it in stone so we can build on top of it. So, obviously, you're not going to wait for 80 episodes of this podcast to come out before we get to the particularly odd rules scenario that came up at your table. So, if a rules situation came up at your table or a table that you've heard about that was confusing or weird or awesome, or you just have questions about it or you want to tell everybody about it, please email me at secondbestdnd@gmail.com and put SBU in the subject. I would really love to answer your questions directly. If you want to talk about the readings, or you have questions that you are like, this doesn't need to go on a podcast, or you just want to chat, then you can find me on Twitter at secondbestu. Or if you want my personal Twitter at STEPHEN_WITHAV. So, sounded out, it's Steven _ with a V, but the Steven is spelled with a PH. Or if you want an even faster conversation, you can join our Discord by becoming just a $1 patron at patreon.com/secondbestdnd. We are in there a lot. Glow and I have been playing Stardew Valley, and we have been talking about it, just hanging out in general. So, some of you might want to read ahead. Next time, we're going to read Chapter 7, Using Ability Scores. What? Introduction, then Chapter 7? What about the first 6 chapters? I told you that we'd be jumping around. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and read that, and you'll be very ready to go the next time one of these drops. If you're looking for more reading, but you don't want to do rules reading, I totally get that. My preferred reading is not rule books. So I'm going to recommend a book every time that either I am reading or I love reading. This time I'm going to recommend Uprooted by Naomi Novik. It is an incredibly good fantasy story. It does this thing that I'm so jealous of, where it starts with such a small, sort of a small person in a small part of a small world, and just through slow, steady storytelling, it builds up this large world, these interesting politics, these like tremendously varied characters. I think Naomi Novik is one of the best fantasy writers writing right now. I highly recommend checking out any of her work, but Uprooted is the one I started with, and I think it is primo. That's all for Second Best You, so see you next time.